but a beautiful day to be out on the beach doing monitoring or surveys or observational reports or whatever it was that all of you were doing out there today on the coast. So welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Jessie Jones and I am the CoastWatch Program Manager. I work for Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. And it looks like there are still a few of you coming into the room tonight at 6:01. So we'll let you come in, get settled. We are all kind of used to this sort of webinar thing, but I know that most of us are out and about more and more, joining in-person presentations and talks in our coastal communities, which is really exciting. One of the good things I think that came out of the pandemic was that we sort of did lean into this format of webinars. And in these days when we are all sort of tuning into all kinds of streaming services, it's nice to tune into our local conservation coalitions, our local organizations, our local science organizations, and sort of see what's going on in the science world. And so I'm very happy that you are all here. And for those of you who just arrived, I think we will get started. Again, my name is Jessie Jones, and I am the CoastWatch Program Manager. CoastWatch is a mile-by-mile beach adoption program, now in our 30th year. We partner with groups such as COAST, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team, who is joining us this evening, and other federal, local, university, all kinds of partners to recruit volunteers for science, for observation on our coast, to learn and to continue learning about our shoreline, our Oregon coast shoreline, whether that be a sandy shore, whether that be a rocky shore, whether that be more of a dune habitat. Volunteers are needed all along the Oregon coast to observe their mile, to walk their mile, to provide information about that mile to numerous researchers and scientists along the Oregon coast. Jackie herself and the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team are from Washington, but they work with communities of volunteers all up and down the Pacific coast. And COAST has been a partner of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition for more than 25 years. They were one of our very first science partners in teaming up to walk the shoreline and report on, in this context, dead birds. So I'm very, very happy to have Jackie here tonight to join us for a talk. She will tell you that there are some actual in-person trainings happening on the north coast of Oregon at the end of this week. However, COAST trains along the Oregon coast all winter long. And so you can always contact Jackie to see what is happening in your community. So welcome, Jackie, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you so much to Oregon Shores and CoastWatch for being such fantastic partners all these years. We really, some of our best turnout in our workshops have been in collaboration with Oregon Shores folks. So thank you for joining today. I am going to be doing a presentation that really just does a couple of interesting touch points as highlights about what COAST is, and then what some of the cool stories we saw in Oregon in the last year or so looked like. So we're a program that has been operating for more than 2 decades now, but we have some new stories pop up every year, and some of those are brought to our attention by coasters, our participants, and some are long-term sort of rigorous analyses that we've been trying to figure out for years and been waiting until we have enough data. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about all of those things to help you get to know all about COAST, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team. And spoiler alert, we're not only about dead birds anymore. We have a second module as well. So I'm joining you from COAST in Seattle as the science coordinator, and My job at the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team is to explain that that acronym just magically happened to us. We just somehow spelled out coast with our name, and to tell you that we are really eager to get you involved with our program if you are interested. And I am going to touch on some trainings that we have upcoming later on this week, and highlight that we also have some virtual trainings that you can attend if you happen to be missing those events at the end of the week. And you can check out lots of information about us at coast.org. So intro business aside, I want to introduce you actually to the really key members of the Coast Science team, which are our participants who are beach walkers. And many of you I know are joining us who are beach walkers yourself. So hopefully you see some of your spirit reflected on this slide, if not your actual faces. We have folks who join our program to monitor an assigned beach monthly, from all different walks of life. And some people survey with their grandchildren. Some people take out their high school class to survey during school hours. Some people survey with their tribal community. Other people have met their life partners on their coast survey and subsequently gotten married. So we have really a range of people who do what they love on Oregon beaches. When we have folks go out for our beached bird surveys, they are taking time out of their daily life once a month for about 1 to 5 hours. They're going to go out to the same beach every month. They'll survey that kilometer of beach, and a lot of people adopt their Oregon Mile to be their coast beach as well. And they search for birds that are stranded on the beach. And just tell us what they find. They measure those birds, they collect identification information about them, then they take pictures. They take great pictures that they can send in to us, and we can identify those birds often from the photos as well as from the notes that our coasters collect and send in to us. The reason our coasters are so great at identification of birds is not just those photos, and it's not because usually they've been trained as birders or as researchers or scientists in any way. They're usually folks who are simply community members who are interested in the marine environment and interested in the place that they live near the beach. So we give coasters a custom beached bird guide that's specific to their region. And I've got an example on here that's actually the beached bird guide from Alaska. We've tailor-made a couple of different guides so that when folks carry our beach birds guide on their survey, they're really looking only at a selection of birds that they're likely to see, and they have a really good chance of identifying those birds all the way down to species, especially if the carcass that they find is relatively intact. Sometimes birds are too far gone to be able to really figure out what it was. We also have a second module that is our marine debris module, and this was developed much more recently. Coast has been going on for a couple of decades now, but only since about 2015 have we had any folks out on beaches who were looking at the marine debris that washes in. But the reason we started this program was because we actually polled coasters and said, what would you like us to help you monitor on your beaches with a sort of the same rigorous methodology that we've been doing with our birds program? And they sort of resoundingly gave us only a very few number of answers that everyone agreed on. And one of those answers was, we want to know more about marine debris. So we developed a survey module that, again, takes people out to their assigned beach once every month. They survey between 2 and 8 hours, depending on how much trash is out there, as well as how much data collection time they need, because every time they're looking at a piece of trash on their beach, they're not just saying, I found one bottle and putting down a tally mark. They're actually looking at the debris item and characterizing, writing down different characteristics that they see about that object that have ties into indicators of the source of that item or the environmental impact that that item will have if left in the marine environment. And of course, our coasters are picking up trash as they go along as well. This is sort of a highlight of the reason behind our marine debris survey strategies, which I'm not going to go into in great depth today. If you're really curious about our marine debris survey strategies, please come join us on Sunday. That's when I'll be announcing all of the intricacies of the debris survey. But we strategize what we ask folks to collect on the beach by the consequences that items might have in the marine environment. So if an item is really attractive to marine wildlife, for example, because of its color or its shape, or if it's very dangerous to marine wildlife, they might become entangled in it because of its sort of floppy, loopy nature, we have folks mark down those characteristics about every item that they collect. So we're able to assess not just what washes in, but where there might be hotspots of things that are especially harmful to wildlife, or especially prone to bring in invasive species, or especially prone to have hazardous materials inside them. You can see on the map on the right here, just a bunch of blue dots scattered across Washington and Northern Oregon. These are all the locations that we've actually had beach monitors walking for marine debris surveys in the last 5 or so years. And these data are they're so new to our program that we've just started analyzing them in the last year or so. And I'm actually going to share 1 or 2 results from that first analysis today. And that brings me to the 3 data stories that I'm going to share with you today to help you see what we think Coast is good for. We're not just out there for a lovely walk on the beach, although that's often a byproduct of a Coast survey. We're really interested in what kinds of stories we can tell back to our beach surveyors, as well as back to management and scientific and academic communities, to help everyone learn more about the marine environment and sort of make good guiding choices for supporting conservation in the marine environment. And I'm going to touch on some stories here that are really something we dive into a little bit more deeply on our website. We have a blog story for, I believe, each of the stories that I'm telling you today, as well as something called Cool Coastal Stories on our website, which you can go into and read a little bit more about some of the academic publications that we've put out into scientific journals. We've rewritten those in a reader-friendly kind of way for general audiences. So I encourage you, if you're interested in learning any more about the stories I tell today, or any more about what kind of data, what Coast does with Coast data, please go visit our site, coast.org, and click on those news and views buttons. You'll see some pretty interesting stories beyond what I even shared today. Enough preamble, though. Let's get to the first story, which is about Murres on the beach. And if you were a beach walker this summer in Oregon, depending on where you were, of course, there's some variation up and down the coast, but you might have noticed that quite a few common murres were washing in on your shoreline. And this was happening at a time where a lot of us are sort of aware of avian influenza in the marine environment and in birds. And we sort of are on high alert and wondering if it's actually come into our murre population near our shorelines. So I wanted to tell a little bit of that story from Coast perspective for you first. I'll step back for a minute, though, and start with what is a common murre, in case you're not a bird nerd or didn't see these guys out on your beaches this summer. Common murres are these sort of football-shaped, in their body at least, seabirds that are able to fly in the air as well as swim under the water, like a penguin, but even fancier because they can fly. They live just offshore, at least during the breeding season, when they're finding rocky cliffs, laying a single beautiful sort of cone-shaped egg on a ledge, no nest required. And they are rearing really just one little chick with 2 parents attending that little guy who needs fish and needs to be warm for quite a long time. These birds are living more than 20 years, so their breeding success can come in waves. Some years we see more of these birds breeding offshore, and some less of those birds breeding offshore. And we can see some of those changes happen in our Coast data set as well. So when there's a really great breeding season and we have lots of murres actually attending those colonies where chicks are getting raised, we actually see a signal of that in the number of birds that we see washing in on beaches. And this is something that is really interesting to us, because we always want to know if what we're seeing without going out with a drone or a boat to get out to those colonies can tell us something about how the population of murres is doing as a whole. And it turns out that when we looked at the timing of sort of the peak common murre beaching rates throughout the year in different regions, we noticed a pattern, first of all. When we think of seeing birds on our beaches, we get a big pulse in Northern California, sort of in the early part of the summer. We see more adult common murres washing in on our beaches in that region in that time of year. That same pulse of more adult common murres on our beaches happens a little bit later and later and later throughout the summer and into early fall as you head north along the coastline. So depending on where you were in Oregon at this summertime when you were walking beaches, you might have noticed that you were seeing lots and lots of murres in late July through August and September. We see adults starting in all of those months. If you're in Northern Oregon, the timeline is a little bit more narrow. And up here in Washington State, we usually don't see lots of MERS on our beaches until around the beginning of September, which can be quite a bit later than what you're seeing in Northern and Southern Oregon. The other thing that we notice, though, is that we see a peak in the number of juvenile birds that wash in on our beaches that follows a little bit behind when we see the adult mortality. So there's a couple of reasons for this trend that we're seeing, and I want to dive into just one or two because I think that they are sometimes reassuring for us when we're going out and actually seeing dead birds on beaches. And that is that when there are lots and lots of adults breeding, some of them are going to not make it through that process because breeding, are there any parents in the audience? It's a stressful experience. You are taxed in your energy, certainly. So if you are trying to rear a chick as an adult murre, sometimes that's not a successful process for you or for the chick. So sometimes we see stressed out, energetically taxed adult murres washing in on beaches as a result of their participation in breeding season. Same thing for chicks. If we have a year where the adult murres decide that they don't have enough energy, they don't have enough food in the marine environment to successfully lay an egg and rear a chick, we won't see very many chicks on beaches. But if we are having a great breeding season, then only about 50% of the chicks that are laid as eggs will actually survive through that breeding season to become juveniles and start to grow into adults. That means that we see a pulse of very, very small murres on beaches following the pulse of adult murres that we see on beaches when it's a good breeding season. So kind of turns around a little bit on you. And when you see lots and lots of adults and then chicks at the right times of year in the middle of the breeding season on your beaches, it can actually be a sign of a good breeding season out on the coast. And we aligned some of these time series that you can see on the graph here with the reports from the colonies that are just offshore, and they line up just perfectly for when those birds are arriving on site and actually rearing their chicks, which happens a little bit earlier in the summer down south and a little bit later to the north. So this first story is one that we actually share out with lots and lots of partners, including federal partners and resource managers who are curious about calls that they're getting from folks out on beaches they're legitimately concerned, and for good reason. It looks like there are a lot of birds washing in on beaches. But if you happen to be in near Bandon, Oregon, a month and a half ago or so, you might have been seeing 50 birds on your kilometer beach. Some of those were birds that you saw last month, but a lot of them are new, and that's sort of the sweet spot for a great breeding season in that area. That's sort of what we would expect to see. Coast is able to say that because we've had people walking beaches for more than 20 years, reporting what they see. So we're able to tell you that in some years, this is actually normal, and it corresponds usually to successful breeding season. So that's just one cool thing we do with our data on sort of an annual basis, is help to share that out and help to show folks that what they're seeing is or is not normal as far as timing of when dead birds are washing on beaches. Because we do that, and because we talk to a lot of our partners about what's normal, what's not normal, when they see something that feels a little bit unusual to them, we received reports this past May, and they were of something that we're not used to seeing very much. And that was a report of lots and lots of passerines, or sort of land birds that we don't usually see washing in on our beaches because they don't live in the marine environment. They live pretty far onshore. And the partners that reached out to us were from Central and Southern Oregon, and they had seen on just a regular old beach walk, they went out and found that there were many passerines washing up on their beach, and they walked along the rack line. They pulled all these birds into a pile, took a really great photo like this one, and sent it in to us. And we were immediately reminded of some of the large wrecks that we've experienced in our history of coast. A wreck is simply a time when a bunch of birds wash in as part of an unusual mortality event for seabirds. And we started looking into our data set to see if we had ever recorded anything like this in the past. Right away, we wanted to know how many birds do we normally see in this species group at this time of year and at this location along the coast. We also wanted to know if this same thing that we were hearing from our partners had happened anywhere else along the coast. So we sent out a call to our coast surveyors in the area and asked them to go check on their beaches and report in if they had seen anything unusual. And then, of course, we and everybody else wanted to know why did this happen? So we did a little data dive, which is what we do when we start having a lot of questions after we've received a photo. It's a great common story for us in the Coast offices. And when we dove into our data set, we looked at that same baseline that tells us when we usually see pulses of birds as a normal thing at different times of year in different regions. And we discovered, first of all, Oregon coasters have conducted over 10,000 beach surveys in the last 23 years, which is just very impressive. If you've been a part of Coast, and I recognize a few names on the participant list here today, thank you so much for your efforts. You have really contributed to making our baseline strong and robust enough for us to be able to tell these kinds of stories. The next thing that we learned was that in the April-May time period when this event occurred, Oregon coasters, when they're walking beaches, usually only report, this is a very, very small number, 0.00586 land birds per stretch of beach that they're monitoring. What that translates to is about, if you were just to walk the coastline of Oregon, you would only find 5 land bird passerine carcasses for every 1,000 kilometers of beach that you walked, which is about 620 miles. You would have to walk a really long way before you found even one of these land birds. So to see those piles that we saw in that last photograph really does start to feel as unusual as we expected. Another thing we noticed was that on all of the surveys ever recorded in Oregon, only 48 of those surveys had ever recorded a perching bird. And the highest number that they recorded at just one time on just a single beach walk was only 4 birds. Most of the birds that we were seeing were things like crows as well, which are actually birds you see as commonly as gulls sometimes in parking lots near certain parts of our coastline. So this really led us to believe that we had identified a rare event. This was something that we essentially hadn't seen in our data set before, and sort of would, as a result, hope that we wouldn't become common in our data set in the future. It would indicate a really strange shift in the system. But this didn't quite answer for us why this event happened. And we turned back to some of our great birding partners to continue to tell this story. And what we learned was that at the same time, all of those passerines had washed in on our beaches. The other thing that had washed in was just piles of insect life. And I am not adept at identification of non-marine organisms. But if you take a really close look at this photograph on this slide, at first it just looks like maybe a sprinkling of algae with some red berries looking like that in it. But when you look a little closer, you can see that there are ladybugs, there are these flying ants. It looks like maybe termites. There are some really big green beetles. This is just a pile of insects, not a pile of algae. So what had happened was there was a really big stormy wind event that happened the same weekend just before these beach walks occurred. And that wind event meant that lots and lots of insects had been blown out to sea, hadn't done very well out there. It is not their environment. And they died just offshore. So the wind and waves carried them and deposited them right back on the beach near where they died. And this isn't an event that's completely uncommon. It's not something that's recorded in our bird data set very often, but folks report this on beaches. And maybe this is something you have actually seen on beaches as well. The thing that's uncommon is to have birds be a part of this event. However, we learned that that's actually not that uncommon in other parts of the country. It's just something that hasn't really been reported in Oregon before. So our theory for why all of these land birds washed up on the beach all at once was the same story about why these insects washed up. It was just a huge push of wind that pushed birds offshore. They weren't meant to live out there. They died and were washed back in again and deposited on the beaches. And since we have such excellent beach walkers in Oregon, that was reported in as it was happening, and we got to figure out how rare and how cool this new story was. We wrote this up as a blog post, just like the last story, and we hope that the next time it happens, we have an even better baseline. We might be able to determine, maybe this kind of thing happens for birds once every 10 years, and that's why it's never been reported like this before. Or maybe it's so rare that in the whole history of Coast, we'll never see it again. In either case, the data record is there for that level of comparison. All right, I have one more data story to tell you today, and I don't want to just talk everybody's ear off because I want you to come and learn a little bit more about Coast at one of our workshops or trainings if you're able to. It's really fun to share some of these stories in person and to bring you some of our tools and show you what we do. But there's one last story that I want to tell about, this time marine debris. And it's again about a partnership. Coast is all about sharing the data and making partnerships so that data is useful to people. So this is about when we heard from some partners in Hawaii about a container ship that had spilled at sea, not very far from mainland Hawaii. And the container ship is this one. It's the one Apis container spill, which took place in the very last month of 2020. So this was a time when there were lots of us were not doing things like going to workshops, but lots and lots of people were actively out walking beaches and reporting in on what they saw there. It's one of the fun activities that we were still allowed in late 2020. And so when this container ship spilled, and we know that there were almost 2,000 of these humongous shipping containers lost overboard, we knew that we had an opportunity to sort of harness the efforts of our beach walkers, and we would be able to tell a story of when different things started washing in from this container spill. We'd be able to tell a story a little bit about the currents that were going on in the ocean and how things got carried around the sea. There was also obviously a concern that there were actually hazardous materials in some of these containers. And so we were helping folks to know how to report what they were seeing in order to make sure that it got cleaned up as quickly as possible if there were hazardous materials. So we actually heard first from coasters in this event. We heard people reporting in these sort of very colorful preschool foam play mats, which I had never really seen before, but sort of they can roll up into a tight tube or be laid out so that a very small child can crawl around safely in an indoor environment usually. But that was something that we hadn't really seen very often before in our marine debris data set. So we started seeing some of those. And then we got a call from a partner researcher at the University of Hawaii, who's part of this International Pacific Research Team that actually did some research on the debris that was washed into the Pacific after the 2011 Japanese tsunami. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the slide, that GIF that is hopefully looping in a way that you're able to see it, is that the mapping of debris that they did after that 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. So there's time running along the top of that little black square, so you can see the years. But in 2011, a bunch of debris was dumped into the ocean. You just saw that happen. And you can see the rainbow colors traveled across the ocean basin. They sort of slosh against the west coast, while a lot of debris sort of remains in the very center of the Pacific for a long time. Now you can see in 2013, a lot of the debris has washed back across to the western side of that same Pacific basin. And they sort of tracked and modeled how all of those things would happen and were able to predict when we would see different debris items wash up on the West Coast and also back in Japan as those debris items traveled around the Pacific. They started to do the same thing with the data that we were collecting in early 2021 as well. So that's the figure over on the left. This is a little map. The little trails of pink and orange and black are trails from over in Hawaii across to our West Coast, where we started seeing some of these preschool play mats wash in. We also started seeing some refrigerators and some really pristine, very expensive coolers, actually, that might be the envy of the town if you had found one of these washed up on the beach. But they were able to track this same process as things moved across the ocean basin. They started first to see some of those things washing up in Hawaii, and then we started being able to report some of those items in from the West Coast. And we sort of queried our data set from our marine debris coasters to see what they had seen in the last couple months. And we found even more of the items that match some of the known objects from that container spill. Some of those things included these really foamy objects. The top center is that preschool playmat. The shoes, the Crocs, and these sort of foam helmets were also things that people were seeing wash in almost pristine because they traveled very, very quickly across the ocean basin to land on our shores in Washington and Oregon. And then we also saw these Wilson balls that apparently were not entirely inflated, but did also drift across the ocean basin. And we saw them in great numbers, mostly in Hawaii, I believe. So all of these objects have interesting stories as far as sourcing. They were all created in different places, but they ended up on this container ship together and then entered the marine environment all together. And we saw them driven right across the ocean basin to our shores in Washington and Oregon. And I just take a look at these items for just a moment, and I want you to consider, what do all of these things have in common? How did they all escape the container ship and end up on our ocean basin? The answer to me is plastic. Plastic is the common theme that I see across all these objects. We have some items that are made of soft foam entirely, others that are hard plastic encasing soft foam, like the coolers or the refrigerators or freezers. But all of these objects were made of this light plastic material that does not break down quickly. It's able to float right at the surface of the water, like you can see that preschool mat doing in the top center photo. And because of that, it has really high what we call windage. And that's a characteristic that we try to track in our own debris data set. So all of these items had essentially a sail that stuck up out of the water as it floated, and the wind was able to catch those objects and drive them across the ocean basin even faster than ocean currents could carry them. That story is something that we see pretty often in the coast marine debris data set as well. And this is something I promised I'd show you a little teaser of some of the analysis of our own marine debris data. And this is that teaser trailer. We looked a little bit at the materials that we've been seeing washing in on our beaches, and we did a little comparison. We have folks who walk the inside waters of Puget Sound up here in Washington, and we also have folks that walk on the outer coast of Washington and Oregon who really have direct ocean facing beaches. And we saw some differences in the materials that those folks saw washing in between the two regions. In Puget Sound, well, first let me point out one thing. If you take nothing else away from this figure, that teal bluish color that you can see in most of these large bars is plastic material. And the other really large colors that you see are really only taking place on the left-hand side here in Puget Sound. So on the outer coast, almost everything that we see, the plastic is the majority material of that object. And that's really how it was able to wash onto our beaches on the outer coast. In the inside waters of Puget Sound, where mostly we're not very influenced by the ocean, but we are very influenced by huge population centers, the main driver of the debris that we find on the beaches is sort of direct input from the human visitors in the Puget Sound. But the other thing that I wanted to point out to you here was that we've really got an interesting story happening over the last few years of our data analysis. And you can see that from 2017 through 2021 in the timeline on the bottom of the figure. You can see that we don't have exactly the same proportions of the different materials in our debris that we find, but it's really, really similar. We see a lot of the same objects that are made of cement in the Puget Sound coming up again and again. We see a lot of objects that are made of glass in the Puget Sound coming up again and again. And then on the outer coast, we mostly are seeing objects that are made of plastic with very, very small amounts of the debris objects that are made of anything else. So we see really, really dense debris within the Puget Sound. About half of it is plastic, and we see more debris, more numerous counts of debris on the outer coast, and almost 90% of that stuff that we see is plastic, which I think tells the end point of that story of the tsunami, as well as of our container spill example that we were able to track in real time. The stuff that we were seeing on our shores very quickly and in great numbers was all that really, really plasticky material. All right, I'm at the end of my data stories part of the presentation. I would love it if you want to learn any more about any of those stories, if you go and visit our site and click on that news and views link that's at the top there. But I'm also here today to invite you to join me and our participant coordinator, Allie Brown, this weekend. We will be in Long Beach at the PUD, or maybe the PUD, I'm not sure how the abbreviation is pronounced, on Saturday, October 21st from 10 to 4, doing a beached bird surveyor training, which means that we will be bringing dead birds and measuring tools and identification guides, and we'll be working through how to ID birds as well as how to survey a beach and report into Coast. And then on Sunday, we will still be down in that same area, but this time we'll be having our training in Astoria. That'll be a marine debris training, and we'll talk about how you record different pieces of trash in a really precise way so that we can get at those characteristics of what's the material, what are the consequences of finding that piece of debris on our shoreline, what does that tell about the story of debris in our marine environment. And that's taking place again from 10 to 4, but on Sunday, October 22nd. So if you're interested in it, you can definitely join us this weekend. You can get in contact with us. You can go to coast.org to click the contact us link so you don't have to write down too many things here today. But I'd love to see you there. And if you're not able to show up this weekend, that is totally understandable. You may not live near Astoria. In fact, we do have virtual trainings that take place once a month, every month, and you'll be able to see links to those trainings and the dates on our website as well, in that join our team tag that we have highlighted here.